They said the old priest kept the kingdom stitched together like a seam you never notice until it splits. Jehoiada had been the quiet spine of Judah for years, the man who hid a single infant prince in a back room while Athaliah was murdering the royal heirs, the man who crowned that boy in the temple courts and put a covenant in his hands. Under Jehoiada, the boy King Joash grew up amid incense and brass, his earliest memories ringed by pillars and psalms. The city felt steady then. Offerings rose like warm breath. Masonry crews repaired the temple stones that had been chipped and stolen during darker days. Levites sang on schedule. People said with a note of relief that God had returned to his house. When Jehoiada grew very old, his steps slowed and his voice gentled, but the kingdom still arranged itself around him. He died at a great age and was buried among kings because everyone knew what his faithfulness had purchased. After the funerals, the hallways of power changed temperature. Courtiers who had nodded dutifully through years of priestly counsel began to visit the palace with different smiles. They bowed low before Joash, now a man with a memory of dependence and a new appetite for being listened to. They spoke of freedom, of the need to breathe after so much priestly strictness. They reminded him that the high places still dotted the hills, that sacred poles could please the people and keep neighboring tribes friendly. They suggested that Judah's strength would grow if its king stopped hiding behind the white-bearded rules of an older generation. Joash listened. Without Jehoiada's steady hand, he mistook flattery for wisdom. He authorized altars that scarred the hillsides again, and allowed groves to be planted where groves had once been torn down. Money once counted for the temple coffers went elsewhere. The gleam on the bronze basin dimmed. Smoke from sacrifices still rose in Jerusalem, but the smells were mixed now. The prayers mingled with incense burned to names that had no covenant with Judah. The people followed their king. Even the officials who had watched Joash crowned inside the holy courts began to talk about blending devotions, as if the Lord might be content to share. God did not share. He sent warnings first, because warnings are mercy. Prophets came like men stepping out of a storm to pound on the door. They spoke of covenant and consequence. They reminded Joash who had rescued him, who had kept him alive in a broom closet nursery while a murderous queen hunted. They asked the leaders if the blood of long-ago faithfulness meant nothing now that power felt safe. The prophets were pushed aside. Some were mocked. Others found their words treated like smoke that could be waved away with a hand. One day, a different messenger climbed the steps of the temple courtyard, where petitioners crossed and priests carried bowls. He was not an outsider. He was Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, the same Jehoiada who had saved the king and set him on his throne. Zechariah wore the lines of a man who had learned to hold grief inside his ribs, but he stood upright. He knew the temple courts like his own pulse. Levites watched him pass and parted for him. He stepped between the altar and the sanctuary where the smell of fat and flour lingered, where the soot of 1,000 offerings lived on the stones, and he lifted his voice where it could not be ignored. "Why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord?" he cried, his words echoing off the pillars. "So that you cannot prosper. Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you." It startled the priests to hear that sentence drop in the very place where blessing was supposed to be guaranteed. Zechariah did not soften it. He named idols. He named the leaders who had bent their knees in the wrong direction. He reminded the palace that the covenant had teeth as well as tenderness. People gathered, first curious, then tense, because confrontation inside God's own courts never felt safe. Some lowered their eyes. Some whispered that Zechariah had the right, being Jehoiada's son, to speak hard truths. Others, the ones whose influence depended on the king's new tastes, felt their faces heat. In the palace, someone asked whether the prophet would be allowed to embarrass the crown on holy ground. Flatterers carried the question to Joash with a tremor of outrage and a promise of swift quiet if he wanted it. Joash had sat under Jehoiada's teaching for years, had learned to bow his head during blessings, had placed his hand on sacred scrolls while oaths were read. But the old priest was gone, and Joash's pride had grown around the emptiness, like ivy on a vacant wall. The king authorized what came next, whether with a nod, a word, or a silence that was taken for consent. Scripture remembered it this way. They conspired against Zechariah at the king's command. Stones are easy to find in a complex built from rock. The men who stepped forward did not choose swords. They chose the ancient weapon that anyone could lift, the same punishment that mobs had always used to erase a conscience with noise. They circled Zechariah there in the court of the Lord and began to throw. The first stones bruised. The later ones broke skin and bone. Zechariah's knees buckled. Priests cried out. Levites covered their heads. The altar smoked while the prophet fell, and the courtyard that had seen sacrifices for atonement became the site of a murder that no offering could excuse. As his strength failed, Zechariah's last words floated up like a banner over the scene. May the Lord see and avenge. Blood darkened the stones between the altar and the sanctuary. People tried not to look when they came near that place afterward. Work crews scrubbed, because blood in that court called out, and everyone understood that some stains do not stay quiet. Joash returned to business. The courtiers preened a little. The idols on the hills did not tremble. For a year, the kingdom moved as if nothing had happened. Then the Syrians came. It was a small force on paper, the sort of raiding army that a healthy Judah might have repelled at the frontier. Yet they broke through with a violence that seemed larger than their numbers. They burned and seized and humiliated. Officers who had shouted for compromise were cut down. Storehouses were opened and emptied. The chronicler said plainly that the Lord delivered a very great host into the hands of a very small one, because Judah had abandoned him, and the reason felt as specific as a wound. They had killed the prophet who warned them. Joash himself was left with wounds that did not close. He lay on his bed in a room that had seen celebrations. The men who entered to stand beside him were not healers. They were his own officials, the ones who had watched Zechariah fall, the ones who had heard the dying curse. Conscience sometimes wakes in the night, wearing another name: justice, revenge, fear. They conspired in that renewed clarity and struck the king as he rested. Joash died not in battle, but in a quiet chamber, his last sight perhaps the carved lines of cedar on the ceiling. They buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings, a final verdict that needed no inscription. The kingdom felt the hinge of the story creak. People remembered Jehoiada's steady years and the way the temple lamps had seemed to shine brighter when he walked the courts. They repeated the sentence Zechariah had cried, "Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you," and they traced it like a line from the courtyard blood to the Syrian spears to the assassins' blades. Mothers told their children that God's warnings are not threats tossed in anger, but rails meant to keep a nation from tumbling. Priests resumed their duties with a hush that felt like confession. Years later, when another teacher stood in a temple courtyard and rebuked leaders who polished piety while casual about mercy, he reached back and named the murder of a prophet inside these courts as part of the long ledger of guilt. He remembered the blood that had cried out and would not stop. The story of Zechariah refused to be tidied into a forgotten paragraph. It remained a warning framed in stone. Do not mistake the patience of God for permission. When covenant love sends a voice to rescue you, the worst crime is not to argue with it. The worst crime is to silence it and pretend the silence means peace. Zechariah did not have the power of a king or the force of an army. He carried only a word anchored in faithfulness and a name that held him steady. He spoke where the courts had been built for truth, and he fell where offerings were meant to reconcile. His last prayer was not a plea for rescue, but a handing over of justice to the one who sees. In the end, Judah learned what the dying prophet already knew. God does see. He weighs blood and memory. He calls a nation back through grief if it will not come by gratitude, and he writes the truth where no courtier's flattery can erase it, between the altar and the sanctuary, on stones that remember. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.